What happens when a man of faith, a shepherd to his flock, a symbol of hope, plunges into the darkest recesses of his soul? A man who spent his life preaching redemption, now consumed by rage and despair? This is the story of Pastor Matthew Sinclair, a revered leader at Advocates of Heaven Ministry, whose life unraveled in a way no one could have foreseen. A devoted father, a loving husband, a community icon, but beneath the surface lay secrets so corrosive they shattered everything in their wake. Today, on Vic's True Crime Stories, we delve into the chilling tale of how betrayal turned a man of God into a tragic villain. Stay with me. This is one story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments. Do you think betrayal can ever be forgiven, or does it always push people to their breaking point? And while you're at it, if you love stories that leave you questioning everything, go ahead and hit that like button. It not only helps me, but it also helps bring you more of these jaw-dropping tales. To his congregation, Matthew Sinclair was the living embodiment of righteousness. Standing at the helm of Advocates of Heaven Ministry in Atlanta's West End, he was a man of unshakable faith, eloquent words, and a heart for his community. Week after week, he filled the sanctuary with powerful sermons that stirred hope in the downtrodden and conviction in the wavering. For the thousands who looked up to him, Pastor Sinclair wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was their guide, their confidant, and the moral compass of a tight-knit neighborhood. Outside the church, Matthew was equally revered. At 40 years old, he seemed to have everything: a thriving ministry, a beautiful family, and the respect of everyone around him. Married to Grace Turner for over a decade, he often spoke of her in glowing terms during his sermons, calling her his rock and the heart of their family. Grace was no less admired. Elegant and composed, she was deeply involved in church activities, organizing women's ministry events, mentoring young wives, and offering a listening ear to anyone in need. Together, they presented a partnership built on love, faith, and shared purpose. The Sinclair children were the embodiment of this seemingly perfect union. David, the eldest at 12, had inherited his father's charisma and often led the youth group in prayer, already earning murmurs of following in Matthew's footsteps. Elijah, 10, was a natural athlete with boundless energy and a knack for bringing joy to anyone around him. 8-year-old Hannah was a budding pianist, her small fingers often dancing across the keys during Sunday school performances, while Naomi, at just 6, melted hearts with her angelic voice in the children's choir. To anyone looking in, the Sinclairs were the ideal family, a modern-day example of God's blessings at work. Their home reflected this image of harmony. The Sinclairs lived in a picturesque Victorian-style house just a short walk from the church. It was a place of warmth and welcome, its doors always open to members of the congregation. On any given day, you might find Grace baking for a church fundraiser, the children playing in the yard, or Matthew working on his next sermon in his study, surrounded by shelves of well-worn theological texts. Their lives seemed intertwined with their ministry in every possible way. But perfection often hides what lies beneath. Matthew's world, so carefully constructed, held cracks invisible to the outside world. Whispers of tension, fleeting moments of unease, and unexplained absences were easily dismissed by those who idolized the Sinclairs. Yet behind the smiles and the prayers, there was a growing weight, a secret so devastating that it would tear apart not just the Sinclair family, but the community that had placed its faith in them. Little did anyone know, the Sinclairs' picture-perfect life was a mask, and behind it was festering chaos that no amount of prayer or faith could contain. What was hidden in the shadows of their home would soon come to light, and when it did, everything Matthew Sinclair held dear would crumble before his very eyes. The twist that changed everything began with something as routine as a doctor's visit. Grace Sinclair had taken her second son, Elijah, to Grady Memorial Hospital for his annual checkup. At 10 years old, Elijah was the picture of health, a boy with endless energy, a love for baseball, and a gap-toothed grin that charmed everyone he met. The visit started as expected. Height, weight, a few questions about diet and exercise. But as Dr. Amelia Grant, the family's trusted pediatrician, reviewed Elijah's chart, her brow furrowed slightly. "Elijah's records show that we don't have his blood type on file," Dr. Grant said with a warm smile. "It's not urgent, but it's always good to have, just in case." Grace, seeing no reason for concern, readily agreed to the test. It was such a small, inconsequential moment, one Grace would later replay in her mind with mounting dread. A week later, Grace received an unexpected call from Dr. Grant's office. The receptionist's tone was polite but firm. Dr. Grant needed to see her and Matthew as soon as possible to discuss Elijah's results. Confused but not overly alarmed, Grace scheduled an appointment, reassured by the fact that Elijah seemed perfectly fine. She told Matthew about the call, and they arrived together the next afternoon, sitting side by side in Dr. Grant's office. Dr. Grant, usually warm and cheerful, now seemed unusually serious. She placed Elijah's chart on her desk, folding her hands as she spoke. "Elijah is perfectly healthy," she began, her voice measured. "But his blood test revealed something unexpected. Based on your blood types, Matthew, you're type A, and Grace, you're type B, it's biologically impossible for Elijah to be your child." For a moment, there was silence. Matthew blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. I don't understand," he said slowly, his voice tinged with confusion. "What do you mean, impossible?" Dr. Grant hesitated, then continued gently. "Blood types follow specific inheritance patterns. For Elijah to have his blood type, one of his biological parents would need to be O. Neither of you are." Grace's face drained of color, her hands clutching the edge of her chair. Matthew turned to her, his expression shifting from bewilderment to something darker. "Grace," he said, his voice low, almost trembling, "is there something you need to tell me?" Grace opened her mouth, but no words came. Her silence was deafening, and in that moment, Matthew's confusion gave way to a cold, simmering anger. The drive home was heavy with tension. Matthew gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind racing with questions and suspicions. Once inside the house, he demanded answers. "Grace, what is going on? How is this possible?" His voice was controlled but laced with barely suppressed rage. Grace's voice trembled as she tried to explain. "Matthew, I don't know what this means. It must be a mistake." But Matthew wasn't convinced. He was a man who built his life on certainty, faith, family, and community. Now, doubt seeped into every corner of his mind. "We're testing all the children," he declared. His tone left no room for argument. Grace's protests faltered under the weight of his determination. In the days that followed, Matthew scheduled DNA tests for all 4 children, his paranoia growing with each passing hour. He watched Grace's every move, searching her face for signs of guilt, for cracks in the carefully constructed image of their life together. He barely slept, consumed by the gnawing fear that the family he had cherished was built on lies. When the results came back, Matthew opened the envelope with trembling hands. He sat alone in his study, the children at school and Grace volunteering at the church. As he read the reports, his worst fears were confirmed. None of the children, David, Elijah, Hannah, or Naomi, were biologically his. The papers fell from his hands, scattering across the desk. For Matthew, the revelation wasn't just shocking, it was catastrophic. He sat in stunned silence, replaying memories of family vacations, bedtime prayers, and birthday celebrations. Every cherished moment felt tainted, every smile now a reminder of betrayal. The man who had devoted his life to preaching forgiveness was now consumed by the raw, searing pain of betrayal. Matthew's confusion turned to anger, his anger to bitterness, and his bitterness to something darker, a festering rage that began to eat away at his faith, his identity, and his very sense of self. He looked around his study, at the shelves of theology books and framed photos of his family. These were once symbols of his purpose, his calling. Now they mocked him, reminders of a life built on a foundation of deceit. His mind raced with questions. Who was the father? How long had Grace been lying to him? And why? Why had she let him love children who weren't his, let him pour his heart into a family that wasn't truly his? If you're as shocked as Matthew was at this moment, drop a what in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to Vic's True Crime Stories, because trust me, this story is only getting wilder. Plus, subscribing is scientifically proven to make your life 10% more suspenseful. In the best way, of course. In the days following the DNA test results, Matthew Sinclair's world collapsed. He retreated to his study, the once sacred space where he had written sermons that inspired hope and healing. Now, it became his prison, a place where he wrestled with the demons that had taken hold of his mind. The DNA results sat on his desk, the cold, clinical language mocking him. Each line was a reminder that the family he had devoted his life to wasn't his. Matthew paced the room, his thoughts racing. Flashbacks haunted him. David, his eldest, standing proudly beside him at the pulpit, Elijah asking for advice on his curveball, Hannah's small fingers dancing over the piano keys, Naomi's angelic voice singing hymns during Sunday service. Each memory, once a source of pride and joy, now filled him with a searing bitterness. He couldn't look at their faces without seeing the lie that bound them together. He had spent years preaching about faith and trust, telling others to build their lives on the solid foundation of God's Word. But now, the very pillars of his own life had crumbled. How could he counsel others about forgiveness when his heart burned with resentment? How could he guide his congregation when his prayers felt hollow? The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. It felt as if Grace hadn't just lied to him. She had mocked the very sanctity of their marriage, the sacred bond he had believed was blessed by God. Matthew's growing paranoia drove him to demand answers. When Grace finally broke her silence, the truth she revealed shattered what little remained of his faith. The biological father of the children, the man with whom she had carried on a years-long affair, was Aaron Mitchell, Matthew's closest friend and mentor. Aaron, the man who had guided him when he first stepped into the ministry, the man who had officiated at their wedding, had been sleeping with Grace and fathering his children. Hearing Aaron's name was the final blow. The betrayal was no longer confined to the walls of his home. It had seeped into every aspect of his life. Aaron wasn't just a friend. He was the one person Matthew had trusted above all others. The realization twisted the knife already buried deep in his heart. Aaron's sermons, his encouragement, his guidance, all of it now felt like a cruel joke. Matthew's humiliation was complete. The man who had stood by his side at the altar had been tearing his family apart behind his back. Matthew's mind began to unravel. He replayed conversations with Aaron, searching for signs he had missed. Were there subtle smirks, hidden messages in their words? Had the congregation known? Had they whispered about him behind his back, laughing at the foolish pastor who couldn't see the truth? Every interaction, every memory, now seemed tainted by deceit. Isolation became Matthew's refuge. He avoided the congregation, stopped taking calls, and refused to leave the house. The once charismatic leader, who had been the heart of Advocates of Heaven ministry, was now a shell of himself. Rumors began to spread among the church members. Pastor Sinclair was unwell. Pastor Sinclair was taking time to be with his family. But the truth was far darker. Matthew's mind was a battleground, torn between his faith and his growing desire for vengeance. He pored over Scripture, not for guidance but for justification. He clung to verses about betrayal and retribution, searching for something, anything that could validate the rage consuming him. He stopped praying for strength or clarity. Instead, he prayed for the courage to act, to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Each sleepless night, he paced the halls of his home, his thoughts growing darker. The man who had once preached forgiveness now fantasized about revenge. Matthew's detachment from reality deepened. He avoided his children, unable to look at them without feeling the sting of betrayal. Yet, even in his anger, a twisted sense of love lingered. He hated that they weren't his, but he couldn't stop loving the children he had raised. This contradiction tore at him, feeding the chaos in his mind. The congregation noticed his absence. Members whispered about his uncharacteristic behavior. Deacon Walter Harris, concerned for his friend and leader, attempted to intervene. But Matthew brushed him off with a forced smile and hollow assurances. Inside, he resented the concern. How could anyone understand what he was going through? How could they comprehend the depth of his pain? Matthew's anger festered into obsession. He fixated on Aaron, the man who had betrayed him in the most intimate way. His thoughts became consumed with revenge. He envisioned confronting Aaron, forcing him to face the destruction he had caused. In his mind, the confrontation played out in 1,000 different ways, some ending with words, others ending with blood. The transformation was complete. Matthew Sinclair, the pastor who had once led his community with compassion and humility, was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by betrayal, bitterness, and rage. The question was no longer if Matthew would act, but when. The pastor was now a storm on the verge of breaking, and when it did, the devastation would be felt far and wide. It was a cold, quiet evening when the fragile threads holding Matthew Sinclair's world together finally snapped. The house, usually filled with the sound of his children's laughter, was eerily silent. Matthew and Grace were alone, the children having been sent to a neighbor's house for a church event. Grace stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she busied herself with washing dishes, but the tension in the air was suffocating. She knew this conversation was inevitable, yet she wasn't prepared for the storm that was about to erupt. Matthew entered the kitchen, his movements deliberate and his gaze cold. He stood silently for a moment, watching Grace. The DNA results still sat on his desk upstairs, but their implications had burned into his mind. Finally, breaking the silence, he said, "How long, Grace? How long have you been lying to me?" Grace turned to face him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Matthew, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was a mistake," she started, but her voice broke. "A mistake." Matthew's voice rose, cutting through the tension like a blade. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. For children. For lies. That's not a mistake, Grace. That's a life built on betrayal." Grace took a step back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Matthew interrupted, his voice trembling with fury. "You didn't just hurt me. You humiliated me. You destroyed everything I've built. Our family, our ministry, my faith." His voice cracked on the last word, the weight of his anguish evident. "Please, Matthew," Grace pleaded, her voice desperate. "We can get through this. For the children. For us." But her words only fueled his rage. "For the children," he spat. "The children who aren't even mine. The children you let me love, raise, and sacrifice for, knowing they were someone else's." Grace's tears streamed down her face as she tried to reach him. "I love you, Matthew. I've always loved you." Matthew's laughter was cold, devoid of humor. "Love? You call this love? You and Aaron destroyed me, Grace. You destroyed everything." The mention of Aaron's name was a trigger. The rage that had been simmering inside Matthew erupted. He slammed his fist against the counter, the sound echoing through the room. Grace flinched, her instincts urging her to step back, but Matthew's presence was overwhelming. As the argument escalated, Grace's pleas became more frantic, but Matthew was beyond reason. Words gave way to shouts, shouts gave way to threats, and threats gave way to violence. In a moment of blind fury, Matthew grabbed Grace, his hands trembling with the force of his emotions. "Do you know what you've done to me?" he roared, his face inches from hers. "Do you understand the depth of your betrayal?" Grace struggled against him, her voice breaking as she cried, "Matthew, stop. Please, this isn't you." But Matthew couldn't hear her. His mind was a storm of betrayal, rage, and despair. Years of love and trust were obliterated in that instant, replaced by something dark and uncontrollable. The argument spiraled, reaching its tragic conclusion. By the time the room fell silent, Grace lay lifeless on the kitchen floor, the warmth of life drained from her. The pristine white tiles were stained crimson, the air thick with a metallic scent of blood. Matthew stood over her, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as he stared at what he had done. The reality of his actions slowly seeped into his consciousness, but instead of breaking down, he felt a cold detachment settle over him. For several minutes, he stood motionless, his thoughts a haze of disbelief and grim justification. "She deserved this," he muttered to himself, the words hollow and devoid of emotion. But even as he spoke, a part of him, the part that had once been the compassionate pastor, the loving father, recoiled in horror. Matthew knew he couldn't stay. He had to leave the house, the life he had built, and the man he once was. He moved mechanically, grabbing his car keys and a few essentials. As he walked out the front door, he didn't look back. He couldn't. The weight of what he had done was too much to face. The drive into the night was silent. The road stretched endlessly before him, illuminated by the glow of his headlights. Matthew's mind raced, but his heart felt numb. He had left behind not just his home, but his entire life, the family he had cherished, the church he had built, and the faith that had once been his anchor. As the city lights faded into the distance, Matthew Sinclair disappeared into the shadows, a man who had lost everything and destroyed what remained. The morning after Grace Sinclair's murder, the quiet stillness of the West End neighborhood was shattered by tragedy. Deacon Walter Harris arrived at the Sinclair home, expecting to drop off the children after a church sleepover. Instead, he noticed the front door slightly ajar. Unease prickled his skin as he pushed the door open and called out, "Matthew? Grace, are you home?" The silence was unsettling. Walter ventured further inside, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. When he entered the kitchen, the sight before him froze him in place. Blood streaked the once pristine tiles, shattered glass glittered in the morning light, and at the center of the chaos lay Grace Sinclair, lifeless and broken. Walter stumbled backward, his trembling hand reaching for his phone. He could barely manage the words as he dialed 911. "There's been a murder. Grace Sinclair, she's gone." The scene outside the Sinclair home quickly turned chaotic. Police cars and ambulances lined the street, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the gathering crowd. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, their faces a mixture of grief and shock. Detective Aisha Carter, a seasoned investigator, arrived at the scene, bracing herself for what she might find. Inside the house, the brutal reality of Grace's death hit her immediately. Blood spattered across the walls, broken dishes scattered on the floor, and Grace's body told a story of rage and desperation. It didn't take long for suspicion to fall on Matthew Sinclair. His car was missing, and his phone went straight to voicemail. Neighbors reported hearing a heated argument the previous night, but no one imagined it would end in murder. The Congregation of Advocates of Heaven Ministry was in disbelief as news of Grace's death and Matthew's disappearance spread. Many refused to believe that their beloved pastor could be capable of such violence. Others whispered about the cracks in his perfect life that they now realized had been there all along. Deacon Harris, now the reluctant leader of the fractured congregation, tried to hold the community together. He addressed a crowd gathered outside the church, his voice heavy with emotion. "Brothers and sisters, we've lost more than just a pastor and his wife. We've lost our sense of safety, our unity. We must lean on our faith now more than ever." Meanwhile, Matthew was on the run. Racked with guilt, rage, and despair, he drove aimlessly through the night. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, regret for what he had done, anger at Grace's betrayal, and an insatiable thirst for retribution against Aaron Mitchell. For Matthew, there was one loose end he needed to tie up before his story could come to an end. He tracked Aaron to his church office, a place Matthew had once visited as a mentee seeking guidance. Now, it was the stage for their final confrontation. Matthew burst through the door, his presence like a thunderclap. Aaron, seated at his desk, froze at the sight of him. "Matthew," Aaron said cautiously, his voice trembling, "you shouldn't be here." Matthew's voice was low, barely controlled. "You destroyed my life, Aaron. My family, my faith. Everything I built, you took from me." Aaron raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Matthew, I know you're hurting, but this isn't the way. Let's sit, let's talk." "Talk?" Matthew interrupted, his voice rising. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to justify what you've done. You smiled in my face, Aaron. You stood at my wedding, knowing what you'd done." The tension in the room was suffocating. Matthew's rage boiled over as he overturned Aaron's desk, sending papers and books flying. Aaron backed into a corner, his voice shaking as he tried to calm Matthew down. "Please, Matthew, think about your children. They've already lost their mother. Don't make them lose you too." But Matthew was beyond reason. "They were never my children," he snarled. "You made sure of that." The confrontation turned physical as Matthew grabbed Aaron, pinning him against the wall. Their shouts carried through the church, drawing the attention of Aaron's secretary, who immediately called the police. When Detective Carter and her team arrived, they found Matthew holding a knife, his hands shaking, his eyes wild with desperation. "Put it down, Matthew," Carter said, her voice steady but firm. "This doesn't have to end like this." Matthew's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment, there was a glimmer of the man he once was. But it was fleeting. "It's already over," he said, his voice hollow. "There's nothing left." In a final, desperate act, Matthew lunged. Not at Aaron, but toward the officers. The sound of gunfire echoed through the church as Matthew collapsed to the floor. Detective Carter knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. He was gone. In the days that followed, the community grappled with the fallout. Grace and Matthew's children were taken in by Grace's sister, their lives forever altered by the tragedy. The congregation of Advocates of Heaven Ministry scattered, its members too disillusioned to stay. Aaron Mitchell resigned from his position and disappeared from public life, haunted by his role in the destruction of the Sinclair family. Detective Carter closed the case, but the weight of it lingered. She often thought about Matthew, how a man so revered could fall so far. In the end, Matthew Sinclair's descent into darkness left a trail of devastation. His once thriving ministry was reduced to ruins, his children were orphaned, and an entire community was shaken to its core. The man who had preached forgiveness became a symbol of wrath, and his story serves as a haunting reminder of how betrayal and despair can destroy even the strongest of souls. What happened to Matthew Sinclair serves as a chilling reminder of how even the strongest and most steadfast individuals can crumble under the weight of betrayal. His descent into darkness forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, faith, and the fragility of the human mind. Was Matthew a victim of his circumstances, pushed to the edge by the lies that unraveled his life? Or did his actions reveal a darker side of his nature, a man unable to reconcile his faith with his pain? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you view this tragic fall from grace. If this story left you speechless, do me a favor and smash that like button. It not only helps more people find this story, but also fuels me to bring you even more gripping tales like this one. And don't forget to subscribe to Vic's True Crime Stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Who knows, your next favorite thriller could be just one click away. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.